On June 1st, 2023, the state of Arizona did something unthinkable. It looked at the fastest growing county in America and delivered a single command. Stop no more. The party is over. For 70 years, the city of Phoenix had run on one fuel: growth, explosive, relentless, unapologetic growth. A metropolis of nearly 5 million people conjured from the dust of the Sonoran Desert. A place that averages just 7 inches of rain a year. An impossible city, built on an impossible promise. And on that day, the promise shattered. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a market crash. It was a single, sober announcement from the governor's office, backed by 100 years of data, that confirmed what experts had been whispering for decades. The water was never really there. Not enough of it. Not for the future everyone was building. This isn't a story about a future drought. It's about a present-day reckoning. A city staring into a 4.9 million acre-foot deficit over the next century. A number so large, it's meaningless. Until you realize it represents the end of an era. Not a shortage. Not restrictions. A full stop. Before we unpack exactly how this happened, and who is responsible, I want you to pause for a second. Go down to the comments right now and tell me, could a city survive where you live if the water was cut off? It's a question more and more of us will have to answer. Now, a lot of people watch these deep dives and forget to do the one thing that allows us to keep making them. If you believe this story is important and you want to understand the hidden forces reshaping our world, hit that subscribe button. It's urgent, it's critical for us, and it's the only way to guarantee you won't miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. To understand how Phoenix got here, you have to understand that it is really two cities, running on two entirely separate water systems. One is ancient, local, and remarkably resilient. The other is distant, fragile, and staring right into the abyss. This is the core deception of the Phoenix water story. For the half of the population living on one side of this invisible line, the future is relatively secure. For the other half, the ground is crumbling beneath their feet. The first Phoenix, the one its founders built, relies on the Salt and Verde rivers. Two rivers whose entire watershed lies within Arizona's borders. Their flow is captured by a series of 6 reservoirs, a staircase of dams and lakes managed by a utility called the Salt River Project, or SARP. This system is a modern masterpiece, built on an ancient blueprint. 1,000 years ago, the Hohokam people engineered hundreds of miles of canals to turn this same desert valley into a thriving agricultural hub, the most extensive irrigation system in prehistoric North America. When they vanished, the desert reclaimed their work. Centuries later, modern engineers arrived, saw the ghosts of those ancient canals, and built their new system right on top of them. The SARP system is Phoenix's bedrock. It's local. It's not subject to the political battles of other states. It accounts for nearly 60% of the city's water. And in the face of the worst megadrought in 1,200 years, it remains remarkably stable. This is the water that makes the central city feel safe. But then there is the other Phoenix. The one built on a different river. A river that isn't even in Phoenix. The Colorado. This is the water that fueled the post-war explosion of suburbs that sprawl across Maricopa County. It arrives via a completely different system. A monumental piece of 20th century ambition called the Central Arizona Project, or CAP. A 336-mile long concrete canal that lifts water thousands of feet out of the Colorado River at Lake Havasu and carries it across the desert to Phoenix and Tucson. It accounts for about 40% of Phoenix's supply. And it is in a state of catastrophic collapse. One city. 2 water sources. One is a local, reliable stream. The other is a fire hose connected to a rapidly draining tub 150 miles away, shared by 40 million people. For decades, Phoenix has been pretending both are the same. They are not. It's a city living a double life. Let me know in the comments if you think a strategy like this, relying on two completely different systems, is brilliant planning or a recipe for disaster. The story of how one of those systems failed begins a century ago. It begins with a single catastrophic mistake. In 1922, representatives from 7 western states gathered to sign the Colorado River Compact, an agreement that would divide the water of the most critical river in the American West. They had a noble goal: to allocate the river's flow fairly, to enable the growth of cities like Denver, Los Angeles, and what would become Phoenix. To do this, they needed to know how much water the river actually carried. So they looked at the records. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they were measuring the river during one of the wettest periods in the last millennium. Their data was a fluke, a historical anomaly. Based on this fatally optimistic data, they allocated about 15 million acre-feet of water per year. The problem? Modern science, using tree ring data stretching back centuries, shows the river's true average flow is closer to 13.5 million acre-feet. Every single year, from the moment the compact was signed, the states were legally entitled to more water than nature was providing. This is what hydrologists call the structural deficit. It's not a drought, it's a flaw in the math. A 1.2 million acre-foot overdraft baked into the system from day one. For decades, while the great reservoirs of Lake Powell and Lake Mead were full, nobody noticed. The mistake was hidden under trillions of gallons of stored water. It seemed limitless. It was not limitless. It never was. Compounding this original sin was the hierarchy the compact created. States were given different levels of priority. At the top was California, with rights to 4.4 million acre-feet. Near the bottom was Arizona. As a junior rights holder, Arizona understood that in any future shortage, it would be the first to suffer the deepest cuts. That was the deal they made to get the funding to build the Cap Canal in the first place. A desperate bargain. Get access to Colorado River water now, but agree to be the first to lose it later. For a while, the gamble paid off. The Cap Canal opened in the late 1980s, and the suburbs boomed. Arizona was taking its full 2.8 million acre-foot share. The structural deficit was a problem for academics. The lakes were full. The growth was real. Then the 21st century arrived, and the climate began to call the debt due. If this history of a century-old mistake is shocking to you, hit the like button. And if you have family or friends who think water just magically appears at the tap, share this video with them. They need to see this. The year 2000 marked the beginning of the Great Megadrought, the driest 22-year period the region has endured in over 1,200 years. The steady withdrawals, combined with the structural deficit and a hotter, thirstier climate, began to drain the system's savings accounts. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, began a decline that has now become the defining image of the Western water crisis. Lake Mead, which provides 90% of Las Vegas's water, saw its surface fall over 170 feet. The bathtub rings appeared on the canyon walls, a stark white scar marking how much was gone. The headlines filled with images of stranded boat docks and newly exposed intake pipes. The federal government, through the Bureau of Reclamation, was forced to act. In August 2022, the commissioner, Camille Kalimlim-Toten, declared a Tier 2A shortage. The bureaucratic term masked a brutal reality. Under the rules of the compact, Arizona would be forced to cut its take from the river by 592,000 acre-feet. That's 21% of its entire Colorado River allotment. Gone. For 2024, it got worse. A Tier 2B shortage, raising the cut to 613,000 acre-feet. The cuts weren't aimed at city taps, not directly. The pain was first felt by the lowest priority users. Central Arizona farmers, who had built a multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry on cheap, abundant cap water, saw their canals run dry. Fields of cotton and alfalfa were left to turn to dust. The next in line for cuts was the water designated for underground replenishment, the very water intended to shore up the state's long-term groundwater supplies. The buffer was being drained to manage the crisis. The system was eating itself to survive. And in the middle of all this, on the far fringes of Phoenix's sprawling growth, the first real-world cracks began to show. Not in a farmer's field, but in a wealthy subdivision. The community is called Rio Verde Foothills, a collection of 500 to 700 custom homes nestled in the hills northeast of Scottsdale. These aren't shacks. These are large, expensive homes, many with pools and horse properties. But they had one fatal flaw. They were built in an unincorporated part of Maricopa County, a legal no-man's land. Because it wasn't an official city or town, Rio Verde Foothills had no municipal water utility, no pipes connecting it to a treatment plant. For years, residents survived by hiring private tanker trucks to haul water to large underground cisterns on their properties. And for years, those trucks filled up at hydrants in the neighboring city of Scottsdale. It was a convenient, unofficial arrangement. And it worked. Until it didn't. As the Colorado River crisis worsened, Scottsdale, under its mayor David Ortega, looked at its own water portfolio. It had a responsibility to its own citizens first. The city had been warning for years that it could not be the permanent water source for a community that wasn't paying into its system. The warnings were ignored. So, on January 1st, 2023, Scottsdale turned off the tap. The water haulers that supplied Rio Verde Foothills were told they were no longer welcome. Overnight, a modern American community found itself completely cut off. The story became a national spectacle. Residents airdropping in bottled water, taking showers at truck stops, their property values plummeting. They were living the crisis in real time. One resident described the feeling of flushing a toilet as a moment of genuine panic, wondering if that was the last flush they'd have. The political battle was ugly, pitting neighbor against neighbor, community against city. Residents screamed that they were being left to die. Scottsdale's mayor, David Ortega, held firm, stating that his city was not obligated to solve the problems of unregulated development. Kathleen Ferris, a research fellow at Arizona State University's Kill Center for Water Policy, put it more bluntly. You have a community that is a symbol of what happens when you have unregulated development. It really is a poster child for that. For months, the standoff continued. Eventually, a temporary solution was brokered, with a private utility, EPCOR, stepping in. But the warning had been fired, a shot across the bow for the entire American West. This is what happens when you build on a promise of water that doesn't legally exist. Rio Verde Foothills wasn't a tragedy. It was a preview. I know I asked before, but are you subscribed yet? Because the story only gets more critical from here. The same legal loophole that enabled Rio Verde Foothills was a key part of Arizona's growth model. The state had shown incredible foresight back in 1980 with its Groundwater Management Act, a landmark piece of legislation. It decreed that within the state's most populous areas, any new development had to prove it had an assured 100-year water supply. It was a powerful tool designed to stop the dangerous overpumping of the state's finite groundwater aquifers. Builders couldn't just sink a well and put up 1,000 homes anymore. They had to demonstrate, with certified models, that the water would be there for a century. This law is the main reason Phoenix isn't in a more dire situation today. But the law had gaps. It applied to incorporated cities and towns. The unincorporated county zones, like Rio Verde Foothills, often fell outside the strictest requirements. Developers could build, and homebuyers assumed the water would just be there. This brings us back to June 1st, 2023. The Arizona Department of Water Resources, under its director Tom Bushatsky, had been quietly running the numbers, not just for a single subdivision, but for the entire Phoenix metro area. They updated their groundwater models with the latest data, 2 decades of mega drought, the historic cuts to the Colorado River supply, and continued. Relentless population growth. They were running the math on the 100-year assured water supply rule for a new generation. The results were so alarming that they were brought directly to the new governor, Katie Hobbs. The model showed that over the next 100 years, in the sprawling west, east, and central basins of the Phoenix area, demand for water would outstrip the known reliable supply by 9 million acre-feet. To put that number in perspective, 1 acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons, enough to supply 3 average households for a year. The projected shortfall was enough water for millions of homes. The 100-year promise, the bedrock of Arizona's development law, was no longer true. So, Governor Hobbs walked to a podium and made the announcement. The state would immediately halt the approval of new housing developments in these areas if they relied solely on groundwater. The engine of Phoenix's growth, the endless construction of new single-family homes on the desert fringe, had hit a wall of geological and mathematical reality. The response was immediate. Panic in the real estate sector. Confusion from the public. National headlines screamed that Phoenix was running out of water. City and state officials rushed to clarify. Cynthia Campbell, a water resources advisor for the city of Phoenix, stated it clearly: "We are not out of water, and we will not be running out of water. The announcement simply ensures that we will not be running out of water in the future." She was right. The taps of existing homes were not going to run dry tomorrow. The city had its diverse portfolio, its core of SARP water, but the implications were earth-shattering. As Sarah Porter, the director of ASU's Kill Center for Water Policy, famously said, "It's not a story about Phoenix running out of water. It's a story about what parts of Arizona will not grow." The era of limitless expansion, of assuming a well could always be dug deeper, was over. The state had finally admitted that you cannot grade school math your way out of a physics problem. But there's another piece to this story. A hidden chapter that few people outside the world of water management know exists. It's Arizona's secret weapon, its ace in the hole. For decades, the state has been quietly building a massive, unseen reservoir, one that holds more water than some of its surface lakes. It's not a new dam or a canal. It's an underground ocean of stored water. Since 1996, the Arizona Water Banking Authority has been engaged in one of the most ambitious water storage projects on the planet. The concept is simple. In years when Arizona had surplus Colorado River water it was legally entitled to, but didn't need that year, it didn't just let it flow past. It diverted that water into massive, slow percolation basins in the desert. Over weeks and months, the water seeped down through the earth, recharging the same natural aquifers that developers were now being told they couldn't touch. They were making deposits. Year after year, they stored millions of acre-feet of water underground. A strategic drought reserve, saved for a future emergency. As of today, the Arizona Water Bank holds over 4.5 million acre-feet of stored water. An enormous buffer. So why the panic? If this massive underground lake exists, why halt development? Why the crisis in Rio Verde foothills? This is where the story gets complicated. The banked water isn't a simple savings account. It's an insurance policy with a very high deductible. First, the water isn't everywhere. It was stored in specific locations, and building the infrastructure, the wells, the pumps, the pipes, to pull it back out of the ground on a massive scale is incredibly expensive and takes years. Second, it belongs to various stakeholders, cities, tribal nations, other states. It's not just one big pool for Phoenix to drink. And third, and most critically, it's a finite resource. It's the state's emergency reserve. Using it to fuel another 30 years of unchecked growth would be like draining your 401k to pay for a vacation. You can do it, but you have squandered your security for a short-term gain. The water bank was the solution. But the problem it was meant to solve, a temporary drought, has been replaced by a new, more permanent reality. A hotter, drier climate and a permanently over-allocated river. Draining the bank to keep building would be the ultimate gamble, betting that the rains will eventually return to what they were in the 20th century. A bet that every climate scientist says is a losing one. The bank provides security. It ensures that current residents won't see their taps go dry, but it cannot underwrite infinite growth in the face of a shrinking supply. The state's decision to halt new groundwater-dependent housing was a tacit admission of this fact. They chose to protect the bank, to preserve the insurance policy for the 4.9 million people who already live there, rather than cashing it out to make room for millions more. It was a moment of painful, necessary maturity. Okay. Third time's the charm, I promise. If you've made it this far into the details of groundwater management policy, you are clearly one of us. You get it. The subscribe button is right there. Acknowledging reality is what we do here. We'd love to have you. Now, we stand at a precipice. The temporary fixes are running out. The May 2023 agreement between the lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, to conserve an additional 3 million acre-feet of Colorado River water was a monumental achievement in diplomacy. It staved off immediate catastrophe, but it was bought and paid for. The federal government used billions from the Inflation Reduction Act to pay farmers and cities to use less water. It was a temporary truce, not a permanent peace treaty. Because the foundational document that governs the entire river, the 1922 Compact and its subsequent operating guidelines, expires at the end of 2026. What comes next is a battle. A 7-state negotiation over a shrinking resource that will define the American West for the next 50 years. Everything is on the table. California may be forced to give up some of its sacred senior rights. Arizona is arguing that its past cuts must be recognized. Upper basin states like Colorado and Utah want to protect their ability to develop the water they were promised. And in the middle of it all are the two silent giants, agriculture and climate change. Agriculture uses approximately 74% of the water in Arizona. As the cities of Phoenix and Tucson continue to exert more political power, the century-old question of whether water is for food or for people will become louder and more contentious. Can a desert state continue to justify growing thirsty crops like alfalfa, much of which is exported, when its cities are being forced to halt their own growth? It's a fight that is already happening in courtrooms and state houses across the West. The tunnel is not yet built that can solve this problem. The engineering that created Phoenix, the dams and canals, has reached its limit. This isn't a problem of concrete and steel anymore. It's a problem of law, politics, and accepting a new reality. The audacious project of building a green metropolis in a tan desert has been a stunning success, but the assumptions it was built on, a stable climate and an abundant river, are no longer valid. The city is being forced to confront its own improbable existence. Phoenix is not going to blow away and become a ghost town. The core of the city, served by the Salt River Project, is secure. The water bank provides a massive cushion. The conservation efforts are real and effective. But the dream of Phoenix, the idea of a place with endless sun and endless affordable growth, is dying. The halt on new development is the first in a series of difficult admissions. The crisis isn't about the water that's in the pipes today. It's about the water that was promised for pipes that can no longer be built. It is the end of the beginning for this desert metropolis. What comes next will be smaller, harder, and more expensive. The city must now learn to live within its means, on a water budget set not by developers' ambitions,